Greetings, we're glad you're here. Today we're fortunate enough to have Raj Sisodia here for a visit at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business to talk about organizational healing. I am Jane Dutton, and this is my colleague Monica Worline. We're both faculty at the University of Michigan and also members of the Center for Positive Organizations. And as most of you know, Raj Sisodia is the co-founder of Conscious Capitalism. Raj is the F.W. Olin Distinguished Professor of Global Business at Babson College and a prolific author and writer and traveling the world sort of sharing this message about the importance of healing organizations. So we're glad to have you here, Raj, and hope that this conversation will be useful to the people who are listening.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So we know you're writing about organizational healing. Would you tell us the journey that brought you to be writing a book about that topic?
You know, it's interesting. It's kind of hard to know where ideas come from sometimes. But if I think about the background on this, a couple of things. So one is I've been using the acronym HEALING for purpose for a number of years. So in Conscious Capitalism, we have 4 pillars. A higher purpose, for which the acronym is HEALING. Stakeholder orientation, for which we use SPICE, society, partners, investors, customers, employees, and the environment. Conscious leadership, where the acronym is SELFLESS. And caring cultures, the acronym is TACTILE.
Okay.
So each of those has a meaning in and of itself relevant to that pillar. For purpose, it was healing. The premise being that we live in a world of incredible amounts of suffering, alongside the beauty and the joy, of course, that does exist, but there's also unimaginable levels of suffering that go on all the time. And I believe every great purpose needs to be a healing purpose for individuals as well as for organizations. Because if you're not part of the healing, you may be part of the hurting. And then it stands for the qualities of a great purpose. It's heroic, it's evolving over time, it aligns all your stakeholders together. It's rooted in love and care, it's inspiring, it's natural, and it's galvanizing, right? So it kind of fits there. But then as I thought about the idea of healing, and I thought about my experience in the last couple of books that I worked on, one was Everybody Matters with Bob Chapman, about his experience at Barry Wehmiller. And I realized that here's a company that's taking people who are burned out and in many ways broken down through their experience working over the years, which is a pretty common thing. People do burn out through work, as we all know. But here's a company that's taking those people and restoring them to wholeness. You know, it's giving them a future, it's giving their communities and their children and their families a future through a different approach to business and to leadership. It's almost like a ministry that is spreading this message of healing and caring and giving people a future. And so it seemed to me that there's something more going on there. Right? So not only do they have a purpose that's in that, but this is essentially what they are, essentially what they're doing. When they enter a community, you know, I was told by one of the companies that they were looking to acquire, and some of the people at that company said as they were struggling and essentially going out of business, they said we had a lot of companies that were looking to buy us. So they're circling us like vultures, right? Because they're looking at what they can get out of this. You know, what machines, what land, you know, what buildings, right? And they weren't thinking about the people. And he said, Bob Chapman is circling us like an angel. Because he's seeing, what can I save? How can I, you know, give these people a future? As opposed to what can I get out of this, you know? So there was that mindset. So it really brought to mind that business can, in fact, fulfill a much deeper role and purpose in the world, in people's lives, but also in the communities and in towns and so forth. The other experience was with a book called Shakti Leadership, which was about wholeness. And healing actually is an acronym for wholeness. I mean, it's a synonym rather for wholeness. You know, to become healed is to become whole again. And Shakti Leadership was about healing the inner divides between the masculine and feminine sides of human beings, also between their higher selves and their child selves, right? So the idea of wholeness alongside the traditional idea of healing was kind of the backdrop for this. And so it felt to me like a natural progression. And then I was starting to hear other stories. So I got exposed to Greyston Bakery in Yonkers, a company that was started by a rabbi. And he started it And this is a company that supplies Whole Foods with chocolate chip brownies, and also they supply Ben and Jerry's for their ice cream, with the brownies in it. But the company started in order to give people a first chance, as the founder said. Because there are many people in our country who never even get a first chance. They're born into these circumstances and these communities where they have terrible schooling and drug problems and violence and so forth. So they never have that opportunity to actually build a life out of that. And as a result, they get caught up in the criminal justice system, and they go to jail, and they come back, and they can't find a job because nobody wants to hire somebody with a record, and they go back. And so they're caught in that trap. So they created something called the open hiring model, where if you need a job, you put your name on this list. Right? And they just go down the list. And they don't do background checks, and they don't do interviews. They just hire the next person, and they train them. Right? And for the most part, it works out. They end up thriving in that. And again, the motivation is the fact that there are 70 million people in that situation that have some kind of a criminal record. And they're carrying them around with them for the rest of them. They have to check that box. And most employers will screen them out as a consequence of that. So there are as many people with that record as have a college degree. 70 million people have a college degree in this country, but 70 million people have, that burden that they're carrying around. And they've paid their fines, and they've served their time, and they've paid their dues to society, and yet we're not willing to to embrace them or give them a chance. So that's really, so again, a company that is taking broken lives that have no future and giving them a future. And we met a young man named Dion who came to our conference, and he said, I've been in jail 3 times, and the last time I came out after 3 years, and I spent months looking for a job. And every time I can't find something, I go back on the street. This time I found Greyston Bakery, and now it's been 3 or 4 years. He's got a little 3-year-old daughter, and he's got an apartment, and he just started crying. He said, if it were not for this company, I would either be dead or I would be back in jail. So it shows the power of business, not only to heal, but to give people a future. Right, when you come at it with that mindset. So it's an idea that has deep resonance for me, and I think maybe all of us are feeling the need for healing at a personal and but also a societal level. And so I think healing to me is sort of the meta purpose of our time.
So Raj, I'm really curious about, in your experience, how do you know when an organization is a healing organization?
If you have an organization where people feel safe to be able to share their challenges and vulnerabilities and things that they're facing. Because in most organizations there is this veneer of professionalism, and people show up and they are, I say people are stoic and they're even heroic in how they show up and they do what they have to do, despite the fact that a large percentage of them are carrying around these extraordinary burdens and dealing with all kinds of things in their lives. Personal, financial is a huge one. In our country, a majority of people are dealing with significant financial stress on a daily basis, and yet people show up and do what they have to do. But in companies where they have created a climate of caring for people as human beings, where people do feel that they are able to ask for help and they're able to let people know, when they are facing that kind of situation, then something can be done about it. So there's a company that called Apple Tree Answers, where they created a program. They called it, it's kind of like the Make-A-Wish kind of thing. I think it's called Dream something or the other. But basically they said, if people are in need, we want to be able to help you. There's something we can do. There's some situation that you're dealing with. Because the fact is that 50% of Americans, if they needed $2,000 within 30 days, would not be able to raise it. And 2,000, that's not a big thing, but it could be a car, it could be something in your house, could be a health issue, and you're that close to a full-blown crisis, right? And that's after tapping into friends, family, and your workplace. And most workplaces don't have any way to assist. So in this case, they started this program, but they started it with a legacy of not caring for people historically, and now they were trying to do things differently. And people were cynical, but people were also afraid to come forward in a way. It's like they don't want to show weakness, So for 2 weeks, nobody came forward. And then finally, they heard from one of their employees, a woman who said, I'm sorry, but I'm desperate and I don't know where to turn because my ex-husband stopped paying alimony 2 weeks ago, And we got evicted from our apartment a week ago, and my 2 kids and I have been living in a car now for a week. And I just can't do this anymore. And I need help, you know. And she was very apologetic about having to ask for that help, you know. And the CEO sees this, and the first feeling he has is one of deep shame. He said, I started this company, and this is somebody who works full-time here, and she's homeless, and she won't even tell us. And it took all this time for her suffering, to suffer and then let us know. So of course they got her into a hotel that same night, and within a week they helped her find a new apartment and helped her furnish it and helped her with all the upfront costs that are involved. But the point is that this then opened the gates, you know, because they told her, you don't have to let other people know. We can keep this confidential if you like. And she said, are you kidding? I mean, this is the most wonderful thing anybody's ever done for me. I'm going to tell everybody I know. And so soon the floodgates opened, and you know, they got dozens of stories of people many of whom were homeless, and others were struggling with all kinds of other things. And they had the opportunity to have a huge impact on those lives, and it impacted the culture in a dramatic way. You know? So I think creating that climate of openness where people feel that it's okay to be vulnerable, that it's okay to admit that you need help. You know, I think to me that's the biggest single indicator of whether this will be a healing organization. And then of course having the resources and the intention to do something about it, and not only from the company to individuals, but also allowing people to help each other. You know, people awakening the sense of altruism in people is something that happened at Barry Wehmiller as well, the company I mentioned earlier, when they went through the economic downturn in 2008, 2009. You know, everybody in their industry was laying off 30-40% of their people. You know, the new orders completely dried up. Existing orders were being cancelled. They were surviving on their service and maintenance contracts. And everybody was saying, you're going to have to lay off a bunch of people, you know, because it's a matter of survival. And the board was saying that too. And Bob Chapman looked at their slogan that they have everywhere. It says, we measure success by the way we touch the lives of people. And he said, how can we do that and be true to who we are? He said, how would a caring family respond to this situation? You know, you wouldn't tell 2 of your 5 kids, you know, that sorry, we can't, we can't have you anymore, right? We have to let you go. So they said, you know, we'll get through it together with a sense of shared sacrifice. And so they said, everybody will take a furlough. Instead of laying anybody off, everybody will take a month off without pay. And you do it when it's best for you, so you can use that time to be with your kids or go on a trip or whatever you've been, wanting to do but had not had the time to do. And people were incredibly relieved when they did this. And the second thing that happened was that some people said, my house is already paid and my kids are out of school, so I can afford to take 6 weeks, or I can take 8 weeks off. Because I know that my friend here, he really needs the money. And so I'll take some of his time, right?
It's incredible.
And they did that without any expectation of anything in return. People having the opportunity to be able to help each other. And as you've said, Jane, so beautifully, that organizations can enhance or diminish our capacity for caring, right? They can either inhibit it or they can amplify it. And I think in this case, these organizations enable people to do something that's so deeply meaningful, which is help another human being. And they create that atmosphere.
When you're thinking about how to resource people who want to create these kind of healing organizations, what are you helping them learn and know?
Well, this work is still ongoing, so the book isn't due to be completed until November, so our research is ongoing. But what we're finding so far are a number of examples of different ways in which different companies are doing this for different stakeholders. Some are doing it for employees or for their children or for customers or communities or the environment. And what we have found already in speaking with some CEOs as we narrate some of these stories, that they are immediately seeing how they can apply that in their organization, right, and what they can do with this. So I think there would be some frameworks, but also some specific ideas of the kinds of programs that can exist or can be done, and how it has worked, and what have been some of the challenges and so forth. So I think there will be, coming out of this, some kind of a roadmap of the kinds of things that you can implement to achieve different kinds of healing for different stakeholders. We can think about physical, emotional, spiritual, types of healing, maybe for employees, for customers, communities, etc., etc. And so we hope to have a framework like that with examples in each of those categories for people to be able to use. But beyond that, it's really the consciousness of the leader. If the leader doesn't have a healing orientation or a mindset of caring, this will not necessarily create that in them. But if they have that and they're looking for how, I think this will help them. Because we do say that the macrocosm is a reflection of the microcosm. You cannot have a healing organization without a healing leader, right?
Well, building off that, I'm wondering how has thinking about this changed you? So how is putting this frame of organizational healing out there and saying, I'm going to write about this, how has it changed you?
Well, as I explore this topic of healing, I think I'm thinking about it at a personal level, because I think we all have the need for healing in our lives. There's always some kind of challenges going on, or with our children, or with our families, or with extended family. There's always something. I think about it with my students, and how it can help them, because so much of our suffering is self-inflicted, or it's inflicted by us on each other. And almost all of it is unnecessary, and it doesn't serve a higher purpose. It's one thing if suffering serves a higher purpose. Then, as Viktor Frankl said, you find meaning in it and you make something beautiful out of that suffering. But most of the suffering that we're talking about here does not do that. So it's a matter of, at the individual level, self-inflicted suffering. As I met this Holocaust survivor named Dr. Edith Eva Eger at a conference a few years ago. And she was literally in Auschwitz, and she was left for dead, and then some American GI saw her lying there and her finger was moving under a pile of dead bodies, and they rescued her. And she's gone on to have this incredible life and has dealt with post-traumatic stress people around the world and helped them. And she said the greatest Nazi is inside us. Having experienced Auschwitz, she said the greatest Nazi is actually inside us. We are our own worst tormentors. And we know, I think the positive psychology field, gives us a lot, how to change our patterns of thinking, right, and how to move from pessimism to optimism. And so there are tools and there are approaches. And we can help people within organizations with that kind of self-inflicted suffering. We can also look at the suffering that we impact or impose on each other. And so much of it is in that manager, supervisor, boss, that relationship, right? Again, as Dr. Edith Eva Eger said, we are victims of victims. She said the guards who tormented us were themselves victims in their own lives. And how do you break that cycle of victimhood? How do you create conditions where these relationships don't have to be toxic? Because the reality is that very few people want to be managed, and nobody wants to be bossed, and nobody wants to be supervised, and people want to be led, right? But you can't manage your children, and you can't manage your spouse. You can inspire, and you can do other things. So we have to look at those relationships and say, well, what are the ways in which people are creating this unnecessary stress and suffering for each other? And I think part of it is the reverse accountability idea, that it's not that the manager, everybody who reports to them, they're accountable to the manager. It's actually the other way around. It's the manager's job to be accountable to them, to make sure that they have what they need in order to flourish and to do their role or their job as well as they're capable of. So it's reverse accountability, I think, from people who are in that management type of role, And it's also servant leadership, in that setting. So yeah, I think there are many ways in which I see relevance from this personally, as well as in the various entities that I'm connected to.
Well, as you know, we have been writing about compassion. And you're writing and talking now about finding joy through suffering. And I think there are some important deep links between how you're talking about healing and what we've been thinking about related to compassion. Do you want to talk aloud a little bit about those
Yeah,
links?
no, your work is of course very foundational, and it's a great contribution. And as I've been thinking about this, so I think there are some precursors to having healing in an organization. And of course, awakening compassion is certainly the most significant one, perhaps, out of all of that. But then you also do need to have in place systems, you need to have processes and other things that actually enable us to uncover the sources of suffering. Right? So we almost need to do a suffering audit of some kind, and then have mechanisms and programs that we develop in place. So how do we channel that compassion once we have awakened it and use it to then result in healing? And I define healing as alleviating suffering and elevating joy. And so I think that's, to me, and as we go further in our exploration here, we will find sort of the broader framing for this. But I think compassion is a key piece. And I would think about altruism as well and how that relates to compassion and some of the other elements, within the organization that would add to the capacity for healing that can exist within the organization. And then, of course, it goes beyond the boundaries of the organization into the community and into society as a whole. So one of the things that I believe businesses can do is they can help heal the left-right divide that exists within society. And that, as we know, is a very pronounced. It's become deeper in the last few decades. Left and right are more polarized. There's less interaction between those worldviews. Now we even have separate media that people subscribe to and watch, and it's an echo chamber on both sides. And it's a real problem. We end up with essentially two parallel societies within one society. And I think, to me, if you look at what caused the left-right divide, in many ways it was unconscious capitalism. Because if you go back in the 19th century, and we had large-scale industrialization, and we had these horrific working conditions, and no care being given to safety and exhaustion and all kinds of things. Carnegie Steel, there's lots of stories about that. People literally falling dead, on 12-hour shifts in a steel mill and working 6 days a week for less pay than they had been before. That gave rise to militant unionism. That gave rise to the appeal of social Marxism, and then socialism and communism would not have existed were it not for the abuses of traditional capitalism. I mean, these ideas were not there in human history prior to that time, right? And so all of that was a reaction to this unconscious way of practicing capitalism, which was rooted purely in self-interest and left out the human need to care. And if we integrate those two things, so conscious capitalism, I believe, can heal that left-right divide, because that difference today is largely in economic issues. On social issues, we have more convergence, right, in society about gay marriage and about various other things. People have been moving towards a progressive consensus. But people are still deeply divided on economic issues. And I feel if businesses operate in this way, where they care for people, put them at the center, but they're also doing that voluntarily, and they're achieving high financial results as a consequence, that there's very little for people on the left or the right, to find fault with that. And those kinds of businesses, I think, can help bring society together.
As sort of a final question, what do you see as the role of business schools in this conversation about organizational healing?
Yeah, no, I think business schools have a lot to do and a lot to answer for, frankly, because we have perpetuated what has been called the selfish, instrumental, and narrow view of business, which is purely about profit maximization and shareholder primacy. And that's been treated as sort of almost a religious dogma, right? I mean, this is what business is about. And I think our students, for the most part, get that message in our required courses. And maybe there's some electives that give them another story, but for the most part, most business schools are still perpetuating that narrow dogma around business, extremely narrow view. As Calvin Coolidge said, the business of America is business. And that's probably true. That's at the part of the DNA of this country, the entrepreneurial drive. And then Alfred Sloan, so that begs the question, what is the business of business? And Alfred Sloan said the business of business is business. It's only about that, right? And Milton Friedman reinforced that. And then agency theory with Jensen Meckling and others came along to reinforce many of those ideas. And that still, I think, remains the dominant paradigm at business schools. And I think the real paradigm that we need to shift to is what Herb Kelleher would express it as, that the business of business is people, yesterday, today, and forever. Right? And I think even the Catholic social doctrine also uses that kind of language. So elevating people and the flourishing of humanity and the flourishing of the planet as a whole as the highest purpose of every activity that humans engage in, including business, I think that has to be seen as the ultimate impact, the purpose, what we're striving towards. Profit is a means to that end. Profit is a social good. It is socially irresponsible not to be profitable, I believe, because society can use those resources better. If you're not generating a return on that, then they should be better deployed elsewhere. And without profits, we don't have taxes, and without taxes, we don't have public, education and infrastructure or any of that. But it matters how you make the money. And traditional businesses make that money, but they also create all kinds of so-called negative side effects. on people's well-being, on the environment, on communities, on their suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas conscious companies try to have a positive impact in all these areas, financial, intellectual, emotional, spiritual, social, cultural, ecological, positive impacts for all their stakeholders. Recognizing the fact that there is no such thing called a side effect. We do things and there are effects. All the effects matter. And can we do business with a spectrum of positive effects? And that's what I think this way of being is about. So I think our business schools need to broaden, the definition and understanding of business and the role of business in society. That it is there to serve. It's not a separate island separate from society. It's part of society. And society is the first stakeholder. And the flourishing of society and the flourishing of all life within society is, I think, our highest goal. And I think, schools like Michigan are at the forefront of that. But most schools still remain wedded to the old financially centered doctrines.
Well, we thank you for taking the time to come here to share the message. And we're excited about this forthcoming book, but we're also excited about the books that you've already put out into the world, and the fact that you are giving lots of talks different places, and the whole sort of social technology behind conscious capitalism with all of the different geographical areas that are taking up and creating groups around conscious capitalism. I can't wait to see what unfolds. So thank you for your...
Thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. And thank you for your work. It's foundational for all of this.